There are two things that have stuck in the public imagination when it comes to John Ruskin. One is his disastrous marriage to Effie Gray. The other is his infamous court case with Whistler. Now, I don't intend to dwell on Ruskin's marriage today, but rather to look at his argument with Whistler, which was made very public in the libel case Whistler brought against Ruskin in 1877. John Ruskin, as many of you will know, was an art critic, a champion of Turner and the Pre-Raphaelites, and author of the highly influential Modern Painters, and he was himself an artist. He's often described as a polymath, one of those great Victorians who was adept in many disciplines, from art and architecture to poetry and literature, history, ancient languages, divinity, geology, meteorology. I could go on. However, in his later years, he turned his attention to political economy, offering alternative ways of working to counter the greed and consumerism that he believed was blighting our capitalist society. At the same time as he began to take action against capitalism, Ruskin moved to Brantwood, near Coniston and the Lake District, where he made a garden on the wooded slopes of his hillside. It's this garden that's the focus of my current doctoral research, and today I'd like to draw some parallels between Ruskin's political thinking and his gardening, which will go some way towards revealing his attitude to both nature and science. This, in turn, will offer a contrast to Whistler's approach to nature, seen through his painting, and also in his gardening. Now, I've deliberately called this talk Ruskin's argument with Whistler, rather than Whistler's argument with Ruskin, despite the fact that it was Whistler who sued Ruskin for libel and brought about the court case in 1878. Although Whistler started the argument, it brought out themes that Ruskin had been writing about for years. Ruskin was challenging morality, consumption, and the evils of capitalism more than just art. His dispute was with society rather than just Whistler. So the trial offers a starting point for an exploration of Ruskin's views, which are rooted in nature and the environment, modernity, industrialisation and pollution. Ruskin, as champion of the pastoral tradition, can be juxtaposed against Whistler's painterly celebration of the modern cityscape. The trial brings into focus the moral worth which Ruskin saw as lacking in both art and society, with Whistler's painting representing the ills of society in microcosm. Many of you will be familiar with the details of the libel case that Whistler brought against Ruskin in 1877, with the trial taking place the following year. It centred on a statement published by Ruskin at the end of one of the monthly instalments of his confrontational publication Fors Clavigera, in which he denounced Whistler's paintings on show at the Grosvenor Gallery. And he wrote, "For Mr. Whistler's own sake, no less than for the protection of the purchaser, Sir Coutts Lindsay ought not to have admitted works into the gallery in which the ill-educated conceit of the artist so nearly approached the aspect of wilful imposture. I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face." The painting to which Ruskin directed his ire was Whistler's Nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket, one of 8 of Whistler's nocturnes on display at the Grosvenor Gallery, alongside works by Burne-Jones, Millet, Tissot and others. And getting below the surface of the painting, Ruskin's argument with Whistler was a moral one. He believed that for art to have virtue, artists themselves must also be virtuous. Only good people could see truthfully, and therefore paint truthfully. This was the central message of Ruskin's essay, The Nature of Gothic, published in The Stones of Venice in 1853, in which Ruskin praised the work of the honest craftsman whose character was expressed in his work, and which, of course, was the antithesis of modern mass-produced goods. The extension of this need for goodness in the artist to produce good art was that art is the expression of the society in which it's created. So a fair and just society will produce good art, and one that's morally corrupt will produce art that's morally corrupt. This realisation marked a turning point in Ruskin's writing, and he moved away from art criticism to express his ideas on political economy. He wanted to address the greed, exploitation and industrial hardship of the 19th century, not only for the sake of the country and its people, but for the sake of the production of good art. Now, the goodness of long-dead medieval craftsmen could not easily be disputed, but it was a different matter when discussing contemporary art and living artists. Ruskin wrote 5 volumes of modern painters, championing the art of Turner, but was later horrified to discover evidence among the papers he was cataloguing after Turner's death that suggested Turner himself was not possessed of the moral worth that Ruskin identified so persuasively in his painting, and this caused Ruskin to question the very fundamentals of his art criticism. When Ruskin considered Whistler's paintings, he was unable to see goodness in Whistler's bohemian lifestyle, his commercialism and self-promotion, making it impossible for him to find goodness in his art. Many scholars have been struck by the similarities between Whistler's hazy nocturnes and Turner's impressionistic late works. And Turner also depicted industrial landscapes with factories, chimneys and smoke, such as his magnificent panorama of Leeds, which is reproduced in the book accompanying the exhibition. Ruskin admired what he described as litter in Turner's work, by which he meant the everyday detritus and trappings of human industry that Turner didn't seek to tidy up in his compositions, but rather included as an integral part of the scene. So the productive landscapes in Turner's paintings share much of their subject matter with Whistler's cityscapes. On the face of things, it would follow that what Ruskin admired in Turner's work, he would also admire in Whistler's. But this was not so. It's significant that the words with which Ruskin chose to insult Whistler are very similar to those used by critics to insult Turner 35 years previously, hinting that Ruskin did indeed see a connection in the work of the two artists. As we have seen, Whistler was accused by Ruskin of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, while Turner had been accused by his critics of throwing handfuls of white and blue and red at the canvas. The slur Ruskin deemed to have been so unfairly directed at Turner was re-aimed by him towards a more worthy target, Whistler. The speed with which Whistler could fling his pot of paint at the canvas was also a problem for Ruskin, indicative of the painting's lack of worth. The ill-educated conceit and wilful imposture of which Ruskin accused Whistler related to the disparity between the high prices he was asking for his paintings and the work he had put into them. Ruskin argued that if Whistler indeed knew the value of a fair day's wages, then his accusation against him was not coxcombry, but dishonesty. So, to the trial itself. Ruskin had initially relished the opportunity for a platform to express his views to a wider audience. He wrote to Burne-Jones, and I quote, "The whole thing will enable me to assert some principles of art economy which I've never got into the public's head by writing, but may get sent all over the world vividly in a newspaper report or two." So Ruskin was seeking to capitalise on the publicity that he knew, just as Whistler knew, would be generated by the controversial artist going head-to-head with the opinionated critic. Ruskin was renowned for his strong opinions, and was in the habit of publicly expressing animosity towards his contemporaries to get his point across, particularly through the pages of Fors Clavigera, the publication in which his insult on Whistler had appeared, so the insult was not at all out of the ordinary. But Ruskin was not to face Whistler head-to-head. The mental illness which surfaced frequently in his later years struck in February 1878, and Ruskin was declared unfit to stand trial. The court case went ahead without Ruskin, and the 2-day trial was in many ways ridiculous, with the defence parading around the courtroom a painting from Ruskin's collection, believed at the time to be by Titian, offered as an example of a proper piece of art. The witnesses called by Ruskin's defence, apart from his friend Burne-Jones, were not in tune with Ruskin's thinking, on art or on anything, and could in no way match the brilliance and wit of Whistler's repartee. In the end, the jury found in favour of Whistler, but awarded him damages of just 1 farthing. He may have won a legal victory, but Ruskin had won a moral one. The practical consequences for both ran deep, though, as the costs bankrupted Whistler, and Ruskin was obliged to resign his chair as Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford. So what can the trial tell us about Ruskin and Whistler's views on science and nature? We'll return to the painting that caused all the commotion. The scene depicted is Cremorne Gardens, on the south bank of the Thames, a well-known resort for decadent behaviour and prostitution. The empty pleasure of the fireworks glittering in the sky is emblematic of the spiritual emptiness and moral corruption of the pleasure gardens, their hedonistic delights momentary and wasteful. The very subject matter of the painting was therefore indicative of its vanity and worthlessness. Ruskin's view that all art should convey greatness is here at its most divergent from Whistler's notion of art for art's sake. Furthermore, Ruskin had often used the symbolism of fireworks in his writing on political economy to express wastefulness and the harmful corruption of capitalism. So the fireworks in Whistler's painting represented to Ruskin all that was wrong with the modern world. The decadence of capitalist society, as well as the hardships brought by industrialisation, were centred on the city, something that fascinated Whistler as much as it appalled Ruskin. In 1872, Ruskin had moved from the genteel suburbs of London, having bought a cottage in the Lake District on the shores of Coniston Water. Brantwood, his new home, nestled into the landscape. Ruskin hadn't exactly been escaping from the city. There were many reasons for his move, but one of them was to get away from the urban sprawl that was beginning to engulf the relative quiet of his family home at Denmark Hill. Visitors to the Crystal Palace trooped past his garden gate, dropping litter and making a racket, and the building itself, the Crystal Palace, marred Ruskin's view of the Norwood Hills. He described it memorably as a cucumber frame between two chimneys. The Crystal Palace, a gleaming showcase of the industrialised processes of cast iron and glass manufacture, constructed using mass-produced, machine-made identical parts, fitted together by a faceless workforce, and providing a space for vapid entertainments, represented all that Ruskin opposed in modern Britain. However, it was the effect on the landscape that was hardest for him to bear, causing Ruskin to see his cherished hills as, and I quote, "no more but as 3 long lumps of clay, on lease for building." It was this capacity of the environs of the city to change from rural to urban that troubled Ruskin. When he looked from his windows, even at the rural margins of the city, he saw the potential for spoliation. A decade later, in his peaceful haven in the Lake District, Ruskin was still expressing concern with the insidious creeping effects of industrialisation. He wrote, "The slightest incident which interrupts the harmony of feeling and association in a landscape destroys it all to me, poisoning the entire faculty of contemplation. From my dining room, I am happy in the view of the lower reach of Coniston Water, not because it is particularly beautiful, but because it is entirely pastoral and pure. Were a single point of chimney of the Barrow Ironworks to show itself over the green ridge of the hill, I should never care to look at it more." Here we can see quite clearly that Ruskin valued purity in landscape over such aspects as beauty and the picturesque, and that purity was inherent in the pastoral tradition. He connected human activity to the environment through the pastoral management of land, and therefore gave society responsibility for the spiritual wholesomeness of the view, and for its reverse, the capitalist corruption manifest in pollution that was staining the skies a few miles to the south, and threatening further encroachment, just as it had done at his home in London. What's not explicit in Ruskin's writing here, but is immediately apparent if you go to Brantwood and look out of the dining room window, as Ruskin did, is that the view he describes is framed by a window of his own design, comprising 7 Gothic arches, which mirror the 7 principles of Gothic architecture expounded by him in 1849 in the 7 Lamps of Architecture. Ruskin's thoughts on the imminent spoliation of his landscape by pollution are therefore literally framed by his thoughts on the character of Gothic, which, as we have seen, encompassed worthy craftsmanship and honest labour. Ruskin recognised that industrialisation and capitalism had blighted the soul of architecture, and now they were threatening to do the same to nature. To Ruskin, industrial smog seen on the horizon represented the decline of society, prompting negative associations with the decline of morality. Pollution was something to be avoided, particularly in the view from one's own window. To Whistler, however, as we have seen today, pollution was a smoky veil through which to depict the city, celebrating the industrious activity of the people in the factories, representing modernity and celebrating progress. These differing stances on pollution as the physical manifestation of industrialised society deserve further exploration, and I'd like now to look in a little more detail at Ruskin's writing on pollution and the impact it had on his garden. Ruskin gave a name to the insidious blackness that was polluting the sky. He called it the plague cloud. His diaries from Brantwood are riddled with bleak references to the weather, describing the demon blackness of the clouds, which were sooty and furious. He writes of the steady south plague wind of the bitterest, nastiest, poisonous blight and fretful flutter. This weather, he also recorded in his diary, left him horror-struck and hopeless, tired, shivery and valueless. So the plague cloud was clearly affecting his physical and mental well-being, as well as his appreciation of nature. He expressed his hopelessness to a friend in 1884 when he wrote despairingly, and I quote, "I've nearly given up caring about flowers. It's so miserable to see them in the plague wind." This despair in the malevolence of the weather was also manifest in Ruskin's garden, the devastating effects captured in his diary, in which he recorded in August 1879, "Raining in foul drizzle, slow and steady, sky pitch dark, and I just get a little light by sitting in the bow window. Diabolic clouds over everything, and looking over my kitchen garden yesterday, I found it one miserable mass of weeds gone to seed, the roses in the higher garden putrefied into brown sponges, feeling like dead snails, and the half-ripe strawberries all rotten at the stalks." Nature, or the devil, was conspiring against Ruskin in his garden. He was not able to tame the plague cloud, and had no physical or mental defence against its destructive force. It was within this context of mental decline reflected in the weather that Ruskin assembled his thoughts on meteorology, compiled from decades of cloud watching. He gave 2 lectures at the London Institution in 1884, which were subsequently published as The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, in which he defined, categorised and described cloud formations and their relationship to the environment. The images used to illustrate these lectures show Ruskin's meticulous observation of cloud patterns, many of them painted at Brantwood. However, clouds had a much deeper significance to Ruskin than their physical manifestation, a subject he turned to at the end of his lecture. His years of cloud watching had shown him that there was something sinister in the weather, generated by forces other than climactic vicissitude or industrial pollution, and representing catastrophic moral decline. This was the plague cloud. And whether obsessive or delusional in his interpretation, Ruskin was right about the weather. Meteorological records show that the weather was indeed anomalous in the 1870s and 80s, not least because of the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, and Ruskin's meticulous observation of cloud patterns cannot be doubted for their accuracy. Whereas artists such as Whistler and Monet took inspiration from the fog in their cityscapes of London, and Dickens employed it to such great effect in his novels, Ruskin saw his sheltered home at Brantwood, together with many other landscapes he treasured, slowly being spoiled by man's influence, not just through industrial pollution, but through moral pollution. On a visit to the Alps in 1869, Ruskin described the spoliation of the landscape with haunting eloquence. And I quote, "The light which once flushed those pale summits with its rose at dawn and purple at sunset is now umbered and faint. The air which once inlaid the clefts of all their golden crags with azure is now defiled with languid coils of smoke belched from worse than volcanic fires. Their very glacier waves are ebbing, and their snows fading, as if hell had breathed on them. The waters that once sank at their feet into crystalline rest are now dimmed and foul, from deep to deep, and shore to shore. These are no careless words. They are accurately, horribly true." Ruskin had recognised climate change. 150 years ago, he was pointing out the very real effects it was having on the landscape, effects we recognise all too well today: air pollution, melting glaciers, water contamination. All of this gives us a clear picture of Ruskin's feelings about industrialisation and the harm that humankind was doing to the environment. Pitted against this, we can see Ruskin's appreciation of the pastoral tradition emerging as an alternative to an industrialised society, and can begin to understand what he was feeling as he looked out of his dining room window at that landscape described by him as pastoral and pure. The purity was the lack of physical and moral pollution, and the pastoral was a pre-industrial productive landscape based on the dignity of human labour. An important aspect of Ruskin's pastoral landscape is that its beauty comes from the presence of people, suggested or actual. Ruskin's ideal landscape was not the untouched wilderness favoured by conservationists such as John Muir, but countryside animated by the evidence of human activity. Writing to his cousin in 1873 after a walk on the Coniston Fells, Ruskin admired a landscape in which there were, and I quote, "no human creatures to be seen for miles, but sound of water and the pleasant sense of inhabited land below and in the distance, and one's own little house glittering on the other side of the lake." Ruskin revered peacefulness, but needed the comfort found in traces of human habitation, cultivated fields and gardens, tracks and pathways, cattle and sheep grazing in pastures, the sound of peasants singing, children playing, dogs barking. This landscape ideal is bound up in Ruskin's economic ideal. In Unto This Last, the work in which he first set forth his vision for a better society, Ruskin asserted that no scene is continually and untiringly loved, but one rich by joyful human labour. Here he was continuing the argument begun in The Nature of Gothic, which I touched on earlier, in which noble art was created by noble craftsmen, happy in their work and honest in their labour. The joyful human labour of the shepherds and field workers was the same as that of the artists. To see these values alive in the landscape united Ruskin's views on art with his views on political economy. Looking at his reaction to industrialisation compared with his views on pastoral tradition, we can see that Ruskin was equating the old with truth, goodness and permanence, and the new with injustice, profanity and progress. The pastoral was working with nature, while industry was working against it. Unlike Whistler, who embraced the opportunities of modernity, Ruskin's romantic sensibility just couldn't breach the divide between the pastoral and the industrial. His vision of nature was rooted in the past and could not accommodate the industrial world. We've already seen this in Ruskin's landscape ideal, in his move from London to the countryside of the Lake District, and in his rejection of chimneys and smog. Just as his view of nature was pre-industrial, so Ruskin's science was based on pre-Darwinian methodologies. He dismissed the theories of modern science and instead looked to the 18th century and before for scientific truth, reading the works of Humboldt, Gerard's Herbal and Sowerby's Botany, as well as looking to Shakespeare and to mythology. After his move to Brantwood, Ruskin resolved to return to the study of natural history that he had put aside to focus on art and then on political economy. He published books on geology, meteorology, ornithology and botany, each of them dealing not only with the subject in hand, but containing a moral message on the state of society. In Proserpina, Ruskin's book on botany, published in parts between 1875 and 1886, Ruskin presented his own science. He rejected established plant classification systems, founded on microscopical study and based largely on the reproductive parts of plants, and came up with his own system, free from sexual references. He also devised a new nomenclature. His plant names derived from Shakespearean heroines, mythology, anthropomorphism, or sometimes pleasing alliteration or onomatopoeia. Just as his political economy returned to a pre-industrial ideal, so Ruskin's botany looked to a pre-Darwinian age before the advent of materialist science. Ruskin's vision of nature had been turned on its head over the course of his lifetime with the theories of modern science. His flowers were no longer to be venerated for their beauty and the mystery of their forms. They were now seen as species fighting for survival in a competitive cycle. Their variety of colour, shape and scent was created not by God for the delight of man, but by evolution for the purposes of attracting insects. Mankind was no longer the dominant centre of nature, and a powerful web of developing ecosystems was proving incidental to the purposes of man. The publication of Darwin's theories and the growing acceptance of the materialist approach to science spoiled Ruskin's view of nature forever. He was inflicted with a horror that struck him to the core, shattering the security of his belief in the unchanging permanence of nature, and instead replacing it with a frightening vision of a vicious, competitive world, constantly in a state of flux. Ruskin's science was based on the truth and constancy of observation and religious certainty, stating that he did not, and I quote, concern myself about anything that I cannot see, touch, or feel with my heart. He was deeply troubled by the departure from the knowable to the unknowable, which caused him not just mental but physical distress, confiding to a friend that on reading a scientific paper, he was, and I quote, sick and giddy and could eat no dinner. Ruskin's approach to science was observational, even devotional. He tells us in his autobiography, Praeterita, that he spent many happy hours in his childhood in the garden looking at plants, and this was a habit that continued throughout his life, looking with his eyes rather than through a microscope. But while he derived interest from observing nature in the garden, he didn't engage in practical gardening in the manner of other 19th century horticulturalists and amateur gardeners. His biographer and friend, W.G. Collingwood, tells us that although Ruskin took pleasure in flowers, he never remembered him, and I quote, potting and grafting and layering and budding. Ruskin's garden at Brantwood was an idiosyncratic mix of memory, experiment and devotion. In fact, it can barely be called a garden at all, set in the context of other 19th century gardens. In Ruskin's woodland, there may be superficial similarities to the principles of wild gardening expounded by William Robinson and taken up by many landowners at the end of the century as a more naturalistic form of gardening. But the ideas embedded in Ruskin's woodland contribute to a complex aesthetic way beyond Robinson's idea of incorporating hardy ornamentals to add colour and interest to ungardened spaces. The woods at Brantwood were shaped by Ruskin into an expression of his artistic aesthetic. His neighbours looked on in disbelief as the woodland, which has been profitably managed as coppice for centuries, was left to grow unhindered, a decision explained by Collingwood as a deliberate recreation of the paintings of Botticelli, explaining that, and I quote, when Ruskin came to Brantwood, he would have his coppice cut no more. He let it grow, only taking off the weaker shoots and dead wood. It spindled up to great tall stems, slender and sinuous, promising no timber, and past the age for all commercial use or time-honoured want. Neighbours shook their heads, but they did not know the pictures of Botticelli, and Ruskin made his coppice into an early Italian altarpiece. Collingwood maintains that this aesthetic approach is indicative of Ruskin's treatment of his woodland, adding what he described as a refinement of feeling, which turned a tennis ground into a purist painter's glade. Ruskin had studied the work of Botticelli on continental visits in 1872 and 1874, just at the time he was beginning work on the Brantwood landscape. In this context, his landscape interventions can be seen as a manipulation of art into an idiosyncratic picturesque, whereby the landscape is shaped into an idealised version of a painting. Ruskin was aware of the impermanence of the landscape aesthetic he was striving to create in his woodland. The cycle of coppicing would have resulted in dramatic changes in the landscape, with trees cut back to stumps every 10 years or so, removing the leafy shelter and encouraging the growth of wildflowers in the open soil below. Then, as the poles of the trees grew higher, the understory would die back and the woodland returned to green shade. Ruskin didn't want this constant change in his garden, just as he rejected the constant change of Darwin's evolutionary theory. To maintain the mystical stasis of a Botticellian scene, he was obliged to continually prune his trees, an activity built into his routine at Brantwood, where his billhook and gloves were always lying ready on the hall table. The desire to master nature contributes to an understanding of Ruskin's anti-Darwinian attitude, and puts him at odds with the growing belief in the ascendancy of nature over man, promoted by late 19th century ecological thinkers. At Brantwood, Ruskin had intervened to corral nature to conform to his aesthetic ideals, manipulating his stream to cascade in the desired way, pruning his trees to take artistic form, clearing paths to allow access, and constructing walls to define boundaries. This manipulation of nature was taking place in a mostly ungardened space, but Ruskin was not working in an entirely natural landscape. Even in the 19th century, of course, there was very little untouched landscape left in Britain after centuries of human habitation. The woods at Brantwood had been exploited by monasteries and used by local people for generations for charcoal burning, iron smelting, pannage, grazing and coppicing, and the land bore the trace of these rural industries. It was Ruskin who put an end to this tradition in his tenure at Brantwood, adding his own layer to an already multi-layered landscape. This is one of the paradoxes of his gardening. He, as we have seen, celebrated human intervention in the land, found comfort in the pastoral tradition, and promoted honest labour and self-sufficiency, yet on his own land he privileged aesthetics over rural tradition in his Botticellian wood. Ruskin's life and work is full of such paradoxes, some of which bring us back to his argument with Whistler, with which I'll conclude. Ruskin made his name as a champion of the avant-garde, yet would have nothing to do with Whistler. He praised the litter of Turner's paintings, with their depiction of the trappings of the productive landscape, yet derided Whistler's work, depicting the modern industrial city. Both Ruskin and Whistler courted controversy to get their message to a wide audience, and the libel trial and Ruskin's Fors Clavigera can be seen as instrumental forerunners to Whistler's publication in 1890 of The Gentle Art of Making Enemies, a subject in which both Ruskin and Whistler were highly proficient.